Hey guys, Caleb here with DSLR Video Shooter. Yes, I'm bringing back the old little intro saying. And in this video, we're talking about skin tones, getting them correct. And we're just gonna jump straight into it. There are 3 steps to getting correct skin. This is regardless if you're shooting photos or video. It's just kind of a universal way to get good color on your skin and make it look natural, which is really important because our brains can pretty easily figure out if something looks realistic when it comes to skin, green grass, and blue sky. That's kind of, the golden colors when it comes to color correction, grading footage. If those are wrong, usually the brain can tell. So it's really important to get your skin correct, and it can be really tricky depending on the camera you're working with. So what we're going to talk about will apply to cameras that have great color science like Canon and Fuji, and it'll really help if you're working with cameras like Sony, as well as Panasonic and others that might not have the same, magic sauce. So you don't have to buy a Canon camera to get good skin color. It might be closer to perfect in camera, but you can still apply all of this to any camera. So let's jump in and talk about step number 1, and it is going to be getting your camera set up correctly. The number 1 setting you really want to make sure you get right is your white balance. So making sure it's going to match the lighting that you are using. If you get that wrong, especially if you get it really wrong, it's going to be very tough to correct. The other really important setting is going to be your picture profile or photo style settings on the camera. You want to choose the most appropriate one for what you're shooting. Personally, I am really in love with shooting log whenever possible because it gives me the most dynamic range, but you want to make sure you get one that isn't going to screw with your color because there are a lot of awful settings in these cameras, and that goes for every single brand. As to which one of those settings are best, it's going to depend on the camera, and this brings us perfectly to today's sponsor, myself. If you want to learn more about each of these cameras, you can check out my camera guides over at the Academy. So that's academy.dslrvideoshooter.com. I sell camera guides there, and I've got a lot more planned for the rest of this year. And in those camera guides, I talk about each of the best settings in my opinion after doing tests on all the different cameras. So you can check that out over at the Academy. So that's step 1, getting your settings correct in camera to get us the best possible image before we sit down and start grading. So step 2 is going to be using a tool called a vector scope. In just a second, we're going to go over and start working with some footage I shot. Now, if you're new to the term vector scope or waveform, check out this video I've done where I break down how they work and how to use them. And if you haven't seen that already, I would definitely start there and then come back here. So that's our second step, is going to be analyzing the color from our image, specifically skin. And then the third step is going to be making tweaks to the color. All you need for this is some kind of tool in your photo editing or video editing software that'll allow you to adjust the hue of certain colors. So that's the last step and the most important. So without further ado, let's actually do this thing and sit down at the computer, take a look at some footage, and start correcting skin. All right, guys, we're here at the desk. Let's take a look at some footage. So here's something I filmed earlier over at the table. And as you can see, it's very flat. This is actually a vlog from my Panasonic S1. So here's the same exact shot, but we've added a grade or kind of done some color correction. I haven't touched color at all. All I did here was add some more contrast back into the image so we can start to work with it when it comes to color. And you want to do that first. Always do your exposure first because those changes will actually affect saturation and whatnot. So here's the image. And as you can see, it might, to a lot of you, look pretty good. And it isn't terribly bad when it comes to color, but we can definitely improve it. So earlier I talked about that second step, which is to use a vector scope to check your color. And I'm going to hit Command 7 here in Final Cut to pull up my vector scope, and you can change that with this menu here as to what shows up there. And most video software can do this. So DaVinci Resolve, Premiere Pro, they all have this tool, and there's other photo software as well, including Affinity Photo and Affinity Designer. So those are great for photo editing. And for those of you who skipped that video I told you to watch earlier, all you need to know about the vector scope is that from the center we have no saturation, to the edges we have saturation, and then there's a whole bunch of colors here. So it gives us a bird's eye view of the color information of our shot. So in this scene, there's a lot of kind of grays and whites and blacks. So that's that big dot here in the middle because those have 0 saturation. And then there's a lot of kind of reddy, orangey stuff in the scene, including the lamp leg, the lamp light, my skin, as well as kind of some red accents on the cameras, and all that is shown here. We can see all the color information, but there's a line, you may have noticed, between red and yellow, and it's going up and to the left. That is what's called the skin tone indicator or skin tone line. And sometimes you have to turn it on in your software, so be mindful of that. But we can use that to check skin. Now, looking at this image, there's a lot of stuff on that line roughly, which is great. But as you can see, it's not kind of razor thin on the line, it's kind of spread out. So we need to figure out what's going on with skin, and we're going to correct this image and make it look even better. So now we're going to move on to step 3, which is going to be tweaking colors of your scene. So what I like to do to make sure I'm getting correct skin is to isolate the skin, because I don't care about any of the other stuff. I want to make sure the skin is just right. So in Final Cut, I'm going to hit Command 5 to bring up my effects here, and I'm going to search mask in the little search bar here. And I'm going to click and drag this draw mask onto my image here. We'll click up here in the inspector over to our main tab, and I'm just going to simply click and make a circle around my face. Now you don't have to do, an entire face, but it's kind of helpful to see that. Next, I'm going to grab the scale and I'm going to blow this thing up. So this might get a little awkward and weird here, but we're essentially just want to get a nice big image of just my face. And that looks pretty good. I'm just going to make a slight correction there. So now the only information we're seeing over in the vector scope is my skin in this particular case. And as you can see, it's actually more on red than it is on the skin tone line. So now we can see that, and we can make some tweaks. And a quick side note, the whole reason we're doing this and using this vector scope is you can't trust your monitor. What someone will see on their Android phone versus an iPhone versus a MacBook versus a PC monitor versus a TV, they're all going to look different. You can't trust one display over another. So using tools like this allows us to make it scientifically correct, and then for most screens it's going to look right. So let's get started on this particular image. The next thing I'm going to do is go over to the color tab here in Final Cut, and no matter what software you're using, you just need to find a way to grab onto certain colors and change the hue. So we need to change red and yellow and things like that. In Final Cut, an easy way to do that without external third-party stuff is to go into the corrections menu here and choose hue/saturation curves. Once selected, we can now, under hue versus hue, grab this little picker and I can click and drag over my forehead, and it'll give us a range. So as you can see, it's got an in point, an out point, and here at this little gray line is our actual click that we made, that red that we clicked on. So I can actually grab this. I'm going to hold down Shift and click on this little point, and I can move it up and down, and look what happens. We're moving that line. Keep an eye on that vector scope. We're moving things around, which is really handy. If I go back and reset my transform and my draw mask, we'll go back into this curves area. You can see as I'm moving this, notice those hard drives and things on the table there that are blue, they're not being affected, nor is our gray or white surfaces. The only thing we're moving around here is the reddish skin tone color. So now we can get to work, and usually what I'll do is I will create a point on this line here for red as well as yellow, because depending on the person you're filming, you might have a mixture of both. For example, if we look at my face here, we've got lots of red around my eyes, my lips are red, and in the shadows we've got lots of red. And then my forehead is pretty even. But if we get down here near my chin, you'll notice it kind of looks yellow. And what I'm going to do is move this one point here. I'm going to hold down Shift. And when you hold down Shift, it kind of locks things in place. So I'm not going up and down at all. I'm just going left and right. And I'm going to move this thing to the edge of where kind of yellow meets green. And we're going to leave red alone for now. Now I'm going to click on this line to create another point right at yellow. So there's our point. Now watch what happens when I move it up and down. You'll notice on the image that we're only selecting those weird yellow parts of my skin. So I'll leave it right there. You can see it's turned it all green when I pulled it way down here. And also look what's happening on the vector scope when I go between these two extremes. We're getting everything pushed around. So we're going to be adjusting yellow here in a little bit, but I'm going to leave that point alone, and I'm going to grab red, and we're going to start to move this closer to the skin tone line. So if I move this, you can see again, we can push it all around. I'm going to bring it and center it right around red here. And already we've made a pretty big difference. If I uncheck and check it again, you can see both on the vector scope and in the image, we're going from kind of a pinkish reddish color to more of a natural even skin color. So now that we have the reds moved over, the other color we need to pay attention to for some people's skin is yellow. So we're gonna fix that now. And we can see that represented on the vector scope as this little bump out here toward yellow and away from the skin tone line. So to fix that, I'm going to grab yellow on my hue versus hue, and we're going to start pushing it around. And what I'm going to do is push it toward red until the vector scope is a little more clean when it comes to that line. So watch the vector scope. As I push it, right about there is where I want it. Maybe a little less. So now if I uncheck hue versus hue, there's where we started, very pinkish, very reddish. If I turn it back on, nice and even skin, which is great for people like me who aren't, you know, all olive or just tan. And last but not least, I might go back and check my reds here and try to get it just about here in the center. Something like that looks pretty good. So I'm going to call this image done. And here's a full screen before and after. You can kind of see the differences between the two. And I think it looks much better. Lastly, very briefly, I want to mention that this works across all footage, and even Hollywood uses this to make sure that their skin isn't crazy. As an example, here is a very heavily graded shot from a Transformer movie, and it's perfect because we got a white guy on the left, a black guy on the left, and it works for any skin color. So same tip applies. Let's go ahead and mask off Shia LaBeouf here, blow it up, and on the vector scope, you can see, guess what? Even with this insane grade on this shot with blues in the shadows and you know, the highlights are really warm, we still have that correct skin on that skin tone line. So even Hollywood is using this. Same for black skin. I'm gonna go ahead and redo this mask here. Blow up skin, and what do we see? Once again, it's on the skin tone line, lower saturation this time, but still on the skin tone line. So this is going to work for any footage, no matter how much you're going to grade it. So to recap, there are 3 steps to make sure your skin isn't crazy off. You want to make sure your camera settings are good with your white balance and your picture style or photo style. Step number 2 is bring your footage in and use a vector scope. We can't trust monitors because they might be crazy off, but a vector scope will not lie. And step number 3, use some kind of tool to tweak your reds and your yellows if need be to get everything on that line, and your footage will be good and it'll look great on pretty much any monitor. So if you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, check out the camera guides over at the Academy. That's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.